Welcome back to Generation Indoctrination, a documentary-style podcast series aimed at exploring the roots and impact of the transgender debate. I'm Billy Hollowell, and on today's preview episode, I'm sitting down with Generation Indoctrination host Brandon Showalter. This is a preview episode. We're going to take you inside what you can expect on the coming season of the show, which premieres December 29th. Now, as I said, this is a documentary-style podcast, and Brandon is going to be exploring some important parts and facets of this debate. So with no further ado, let's sit down with Brandon Showalter to hear what he is going to bring you on the new season of Generation Indoctrination. Brandon Showalter, we are here with a preview episode. I am so excited for season 3 of Generation Indoctrination. The season is premiering later this month, and there's a lot I want to ask you about this. We put this episode together so that people can get a sense of what you're going to be doing on this documentary style podcast, what we're going to be showing and presenting in season 3. So I guess let's start there. What can people expect from you on this new season of the show?
Well, the thing that is really animating me and is animating the whole team really at the Christian Post is we consider the progress that has been made with regard to this issue in 2023. In many ways, it's been a year unlike any other, and I have been on this beat as a journalist for approximately 7 years. It's been a night and day difference. The big thing is the state level legislative push where people have risen up within those legislatures, elected representatives and state senators to prohibit the transing chemically and surgically of children. And we have, I think, 20 or 21 states in total, but 17 of them have happened this year. And as we speak, Ohio is currently considering a bill. So that could be the 18th state if that happens. And so the issue has been forced into a national discussion. And trans activists have been operating by stealth and in very sneaky fashion for all of these years. And so finally, they are no longer able to do that because I think not only with the legislative push, but with this cultural awareness that journalists that have been writing about this finally there was enough people, sort of a groundswell was created in light of the critical reporting that has been consistently put out there, not least of which has been this very podcast series and our reporting at the Christian Post. But we sort of felt like we had to do another season of this series just because of all of the podcast. And there were other unexplored angles that we didn't get to cover so much in seasons 1 and 2. Season 2, of course, was the audiobook of the ebook that I co-authored with Jeff Myers. But there are more angles to explore. But the main thing I would say is that 2023 has just been an amazing year where we have seen people really start to get it and what's at stake, particularly regarding the atrocious medical scandal that transgenderism represents.
Well, and as you were saying, one of the episodes is going to be about public policy. So people will get a chance to really hear you flesh that out with the experts on what is happening, legally speaking, in those 17 states. And as you mentioned, there could soon be an 18th state. And I think we're going to see even more of that go on. So I think that's going to be really, really interesting to hear. Before we get into some of the other preview content, you and I have talked about this a lot in the past, and getting a chance to executive produce this with you, work on this with you has been very interesting for me, as I've learned a lot in the process. But what has motivated you to continue exploring these realities? Because these stories, they're dark, they're difficult, they're often depressing, and it's a heavy issue. What has continued to spark your passion for diving into these topics?
I think the main thing is that I continue to hear from the victims and their families. I say transgenderism, it represents a medical scandal. I think that's where the most egregious harm is. It damages people's bodies, the irreversible surgeries and the hormone blockers and the cross-sex hormones. It's one of the most horrendous medical scandals the world has ever seen. But unlike previous medical scandals, and I say this a lot when I've done interviews around this subject, is that this medical scandal carries with it social currency if you participate in it. This is marketed to a generation of youth as an identity. And so, concurrent with the horrific medical harm that's being done to their bodies, they are being inculcated with messages in schools, indoctrinated online to believe that this is some kind of positive empowerment. I don't think we've ever seen that with a medical scandal. As far as I know, uh, you know, lobotomies and thalidomide and opioids, that wasn't marketed to our youth as though this is who they are. That's what's so insidious about this. And it also fractures families. And it is, I think, as a Christian, I am compelled to speak up for those who have no voice, to defend the weak. And this medical scandal is preying upon those who already are having a hard time in life. Their mental health is not good. It seems like every other phone call that I receive from a desperate parent, their son or daughter is on the autism spectrum. So there are many factors that motivate me, but the other thing that I think is just so crucial here as a Christian is that I very much believe that if we as Christians distort Genesis 1:27, which declares that we are made male and female in God's image, if we get that wrong, we get the entire gospel wrong. And so this issue is of primary importance. You can't just say this is some sort of bizarre, weird issue on the margins. It's like, no, what is at stake is the gospel. If we don't have a clear, unified message in terms of what we're saying about a social force and scourge that is distorting the very meaning of being human, I mean, the Christian faith will have no meaning at all, because we have something very important to say about all of that. And so this I think this issue just touches to the very core of what we as Christians are all about. But again, I would just say though that the medical scandal, I mean, that would be reason enough. But this is obviously touching more areas than just the medical aspect. But I think I think what keeps me motivated at the end of the day is that I just see so many hurting families. And this has not been an area where the corporate press has paid much attention at all. In fact, I think they have enabled these medical crimes even further, because they have participated in a systemic twisting of language that has covered up the medical atrocities in the minds of the public. One of the things that listeners will hear in uh, one of the episodes is just how much of a generational gap there is in understanding. You really have to ease older folks into just how terrible these medical atrocities are, because it's so unpleasant and it's like they can't believe it. But the younger generations, you almost have to wake them up, because they're inured to just how terrible these things are. They know it's happening, but they've been indoctrinated. Many of them have, to believe that cutting off body parts and taking drugs that'll sterilize you is actually a good thing. So it's a very multifaceted challenge we face, and so we need good journalistic work to sort of air it all out and explain it as truthfully as it can be explained.
Well, and that's what you're going to be doing once again on season 3 of Generation Indoctrination. One of the episodes, you devote an entire episode, in fact, to California. And that is interesting for a variety of reasons. For those who don't know, as a preview, why is California so important to this broader conversation about the transgender battle?
I think that the state of California, um, I'm convinced that it is sort of the epicenter of where a lot of trans activism comes in this country. Of course, it's big in all of the major cities, but I think there's been, in terms of legislation that has been passed through the legislature and signed by Governor Gavin Newsom, that's where much of it has happened. Uh, Obviously, liberal states have similar policies, but California has been leading the way. And in the episode on California, I explore some of the political dynamics that have given rise to that. I also explore some of the nitty gritty of the legislation that has been passed through the legislature that funds this medical experiment, and also has enabled the placement of hardened criminals, including sexual offenders, predators, rapists, into prisons with women. In the bonus episode of season 1, we explored the issue of prisons with 3 advocates, and one of those women that I interviewed was part of our event that we did in March, and I re-interview her again, because during that first bonus episode I mentioned a famous case where a man who savagely murdered a lesbian couple and their son, it was pending at the time whether or not he was going to be placed in the women's prison. That was unknown when we recorded the bonus episode in season one. Well, it is now officially official. He has indeed been placed into the prison. So I just kind of wanted to give people an update about no, this is still going on, and people going full bore ahead. California, other than that, though, they've always been kind of a it's where a lot of the cultural creativity comes. Obviously, we know Hollywood, the film industry is there, and with the tech culture in San Francisco, there are many sort of unique contributing factors in the Golden State that have been sort of the perfect petri dish for the explosion of transgender activism. And so, again, with that plus the legislative side and the just the huge population that the state has, we just thought, well, we've got to devote an episode to this. And as someone in that episode says, this ideology has to be defeated there if it's to be defeated anywhere, because we see a lot of conservative states passing bills, as I was just mentioning a moment ago, but California is enabling people to come from those conservative states and provide refuge, be a trans sanctuary state. So even if red states ban this kind of thing, California is prepared to move into the other direction. And so we're going to have to figure out what's going on there, because they're, trying to counteract what's going on elsewhere. So it's a multi-pronged you know issue there, and how it's exploding from the West Coast.
Yeah, and I think that's important for people to understand. And you mentioned the prison issue, which is just unbelievable. There's so many elements there in California that are important to explore, and you'll be doing that on the episode. Another episode, you're going to be focusing in on some of the parents, and you've spent a lot of time talking with parents who have had to fight for sanity once their kids come out as transgender, or they're struggling, with these feelings and emotions. These parents find themselves really in a hellish situation. What role will those parents have in this season? Give us a little preview of that.
Well, I think the parents have been the unheard voices in this entire space. They've been screaming and trying to be heard, but a lot of them have been silenced and marginalized over the years. And they can talk to conservative media, but a lot of them are afraid to talk at all, because if they don't affirm their child, they think that CPS could come after them, remove their custody. I know of cases where that has happened. Or, and this is more common, they don't want to get fired, or if they live in a liberal area, they are afraid of social ostracism. And so there's so many things that parents have dealt with, and I think the family rupture that transgenderism has caused has been an under discussed area, and I think is the next phase of the fallout. We're seeing some detransitioners come forward now and testify in these state legislatures, and increasingly go to media and talk about the medical harm to their bodies. What we have not heard so much is the family pain, and I think it's quite potent, because transgenderism fractures families into a thousand little pieces. I was a part of a documentary that does explore that was released almost a year ago, called Dead Name, which that's been a huge catalyst for conversation about how this pits parents against their children and children against their families. But we're going to be hearing from more of those devastated parents. I think it's one of the most profound things that's happening in our society, and books are going to need to be written about how this movement came along and just upended their lives. And you're going to hear from some parents in this series that have endured the worst possible losses, and the torment and the staggering pain that they have endured as they've watched their children disintegrate into this madness and irreversibly harm their bodies with these drugs and surgeries. It is an excruciating, exquisite form of torture, as one mom has put it to me. It's so vital that we hear their voices.
Well, and in addition to the parents' voices, we also have another group of people traditionally underheard from, underserved, and that is the detransitioners, those who, had attempted to transition or started to transition and have then realized this is not the correct path they should be on. Why did you feel it was important to include some of those voices in this upcoming season?
Well, I think it's just they have been the bearers of the worst possible harm of this movement. There's a lot of discussion when people think of transgenderism now, they think of Leah Thomas, Will Thomas, his name, the swimmer, who I think that was a real turning point this year. People saw him, swimming at the NCAA championships against women, and they think of the sports issue, or they think about men and women's spaces. But again, the medical harm, this medical scandal, is the worst harm just in so many ways. It's just the most awful. It's the most awful harm that can be caused. I don't want to minimize any other area where transgenderism invades and causes harm, but when you're actually cutting off a perfectly healthy body part, or you're giving drugs to a young person that renders them sterile, well, if you can talk to the people who actually underwent that and unpack how it was that they came to believe that they needed to do something so damaging, well, I mean, that's as a journalist, that's just a riveting story anyway, because I don't think we've ever seen a time in that I'm aware of where we had the ideological apparatus to convince young people that their bodies are wrong and they needed to cut body parts off, and they would actually do it to them when they were minors, and they would manipulate their parents to consent to it to make them think that they would be dead by suicide if they didn't. I mean, the insanity is just so immense. And so I figure it behooves me as a journalist to sort of talk to the people who have now done a 180 and say, actually it was all a lie and I was duped, and I was manipulated. If anything, they are the people we need to hear from most, because they were victims of the worst possible harm in any of this space. And so we've got one story in particular from a detransitioner who I think our audience is going to be riveted by what he has to say, and how it was that he got facilitated through the institution that, in his case, amputated his testicles. It was out in the state of Oregon, which, we've got an episode on California, but I could argue that the state of Oregon is even worse shape, particularly the city of Portland. It's a madhouse out there.
The last question for you as we sort of navigate through this preview, what are you going to be leaving people with? Because at the end of this season, I know that you take a really unique approach in the final episode. What is your hope for what you can accomplish through season 3?
Well, I think it's important that season three does highlight the progress in 2023, because it has been a very different year. I mean, it's like there's a critical mass that has arisen, and there's an awareness, and there's, meaningful legislative debate because of what the states have done. And obviously, this is going to be an issue in the 2024 election and the lead up to it. But I think it's important, especially as a publication, as the Christian Post, that it is put on the record just where we stood and what we have done. I mean, I'm very proud to work with a great team here at CP, that, unlike other publications that carry the name of Christ, we have been unequivocal. But that's because we have the hope of the gospel animating us. And so in the final episode, we talk about how the church can and should respond. We believe, as Christians and as journalists here at the Christian Post, that we have much better story, capital S story, to tell. That the gospel provides the antidote for what ails us, including when it comes to gender confusion. We believe that the Lord Jesus Christ can and does do miracles. That for some of these people, the damage that's been done to their bodies through these drugs and surgeries, I'm going to believe for great healing for them. But we believe that there's a generation that's crying out for clarity and for gospel truth, that we are made male and female in his image, and that there's a much more healthy and wholesome and life giving vision that is embedded in the message of the gospel. And so the last episode is about how can the church respond in love and with truth. Um, we didn't touch on that so much in the first episode, and indeed, not every episode, even in this season, is it all Christians. We interview a variety of people who do not believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. But this final episode in season three is about the church and just the vision that we have. Jeff Myers and I, in our ebook, um, the last chapter was about this very thing. And he is one of my guests in this final episode, because it's one thing to point out the harms of gender ideology, to expose the medical scandal, to talk about the ways in which it diminishes women's rights and affects other things. But if we don't respond with the truth of who God is and the message of the gospel, I think we're wasting our time. but we're not going to shy away from that at the Christian Post. And so we're happy to unpack that in the final episode of this season.
Well, Brandon, I am really excited to hear the final product of this. I know a lot of work has gone into this, and you have very much selflessly approached this topic and provided people with, a lot of important information that they're not going to hear other places in the media. And so season 3 of Generation Indoctrination is hitting later this month. Very excited about that and appreciate you joining me for this preview today.
Thank you, Billy. So good to be with you always.
That's all for today's preview episode of Generation Indoctrination. Make sure you subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review, and stay tuned for December 29th when season 3 of the show premieres. We'll see you then.